Chapter 33, Traitors.
Dad,
Whispered Rachel.
do you think you can walk?
I think so.
Whispered Ivan.
It felt like a weight was on his chest.
He pushed a crumpled piece of paper into his shirt pocket. They began to exit his office. Rachel looked both ways, her dad's arm draped over her shoulder. Whatever Ishani gave him almost did him in completely. Thank goodness that Pandora showed up when he did. Rachel always knew Ishani was evil, she just did not know how far gone she was. Ivan had felt so guilty for lying about the past that he had given up fighting Ishani. Somehow, he knew that this day would come. She likely gave Dr. Crowning the whole idea of murdering Rachel's real mother, Ishani's own sister, all those years ago. As they were heading toward Pandora's office, more rumbling occurred, causing them to sway.
Just a little further, Dad,
said Rachel as she and Ivan were within a few yards of Pandora's doorway. Suddenly, a familiar face rounded the corner.
Judas, what are you doing here?
Rachel was stunned to see him. The last place she saw him was after the earthquake back in Indiana. And the last thing she knew, he had gotten her and Joel fired. She noticed he seemed much different. He had lost weight and looked like a bodybuilder. However, his eyes had dark circles underneath them, as if he had not slept for weeks.
Rachel, I have been here finishing the interview since Joel left. Man, I am so sorry that I treated you both so wrong. I had no idea how crazy this place is. I just called Joel, and he said he was coming to rescue you. I told him I was already here, and could help you and your dad get out to meet him.
Oh, thank you so much, Judas. Yes, we need to find our way out. This is my dad, Ivan. Ishani tried to kill him. We need to get out of here.
Ivan's head slumped, and Rachel struggled to hold him up.
Here, let me help you,
said Judas, hoisting him up.
Thank you.
Ivan began. However, his voice was cut short when a forceful blow hit his back. Blood spattered against Rachel's wedding dress, and more trickled down from Ivan's mouth. His eyes widened in terror. He immediately collapsed to the floor. Ishani and the assistant, with his face freshly repaired, stood behind them. They held guns in their hands and pointed directly at them. Gun smoke rolled from Ishani's barrel. Rachel knelt over Ivan, horrified.
Dad!
He gasped for breath, clinging to Rachel. Soon, he was no longer breathing, and all signs of life in his eyes were gone. She turned toward Ishani. Rachel's teary eyes reddened into rage.
How could you evil witch?
Ishani waved her finger.
Didn't I teach you that calling people names is not polite? Get her,
she said, her green eyes glowing with hatred. Rachel got up to run, but Judas grabbed her arm, stopping her. She tried to wrench herself free.
What are you doing, Judas? Let go of me.
He looked into her eyes, and his darkened gaze made her realize he had betrayed them all. He forced his burly arms around her. Rachel tore at his eyes to get loose. Judas yelled out in anger, but continued to hold on to Rachel. His mind flashed back to when he and his family first encountered this place a few years ago. He had been overly curious about the sudden UFO sightings. When his family was skywatching, the ball of light appeared. He recalled flashes of them being abducted and some beings experimenting on their bodies in a white lab. They made his body feel powerful, and he liked it. However, they forced his mind to act on killing his parents, and upon their return home, his brother took the blame for him. His mother had fought back too. One thing had not changed, his breath still reeked of death. Then, Rachel noticed some thin wires springing from his head as if he were one of their science experiments. She tore them loose, and tiny bits of his brain slithered out with them, like thin hairs of spaghetti. Judas rang out a high-pitched scream and knelt on the floor, convulsing and writhing in agony. Rachel sprinted down the corridor, twisting toward the other side of the facilities.
Don't just sit there, you fool. Get her.
Ishani yelled unmercifully at Judas.
What kind of a whack job is this?
She yelled at the assistant.
We cannot allow our soldiers to have wires dangling from their heads. You must remedy any weakness.
Yes, ma'am,
said the assistant, saluting her stiffly. Judas got up, stumbling and blurry-eyed.
Don't let her get away,
yelled Ishani, stomping her foot. Judas began to put one foot in front of the other. The assistant passed him up in pursuit. Rachel did not know exactly how she could escape with all of the guards at every corner. However, she came to a new room that seemed to be secluded. No one was around, so she locked herself in and attempted to catch her breath. Her heart was racing, and she feared it was so loud they might hear it outside the door. Her palms were sweaty and shaky. Although she was breathing, she felt as if she was barely getting oxygen. She felt like a hunted animal. Any noise she made could get her killed. Suddenly, she remembered something from her past. She wore a beautiful pink poofy dress, just like the princesses she'd seen on TV.
We'll call you Rachel. How does that sound?
Rachel was about 3 years old, but she remembered it clearly. It was her dad, Ivan, speaking to her after the adoption. He was the only dad that she had ever known. She wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, grateful to belong to someone after losing what, exactly? A younger Ishani came in. Her eyes actually seemed gentle.
I'm here now, sweetie. This is your daddy, and we will take care of you together.
She smiled at Rachel. Was she her mother? Something terrible had happened, but what was it? Back then, she thought that Ishani was her birth mother. However, she now realized she was her mother's evil twin, which had confused Rachel throughout most of her childhood. Rachel now recognized that Ishani had faked any gentleness from that point forward. Rachel flashed forward in her memories. About 10 years later, she had her first major conflict with Ishani. She controlled Rachel, not allowing her to attend school or have friends. Ivan had just finished comforting her and saying their nightly prayers. Then Ishani came into the room. Finally, 13-year-old Rachel asked,
Do you love me, Mom?
Well, that is quite the question. You do remember that I'm not really your mother, don't you?
Rachel never forgot that moment, as if it was seared into her brain permanently. Ishani smirked at her remark, enjoying the shock and confusion it caused. She had almost remembered her birth mother back then, but Ishani sent her to therapy. Any hope of remembering her early years was gone. Until she came here and saw Annika's picture with her biological dad, Thomas Katz, aka Pandora. She thought of Joel, their first kiss, his proposal.
Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?
Rachel remembered the sincerity in his voice and asking her the words that she had longed to hear. Then she drew into the sweet moments when they had eloped and said,
I do.
I do.
And their wedding night when they became one. Rachel had wanted those moments to last forever. Then a horrible thought invaded her mind. What if Ishani had allowed her to be close to Joel's family to draw them into her elaborate scheme? However, that thought would drive her even more over the edge, so she pushed it out of her mind. Rachel knew it was a mistake for Joel to leave her alone in this place. She needed him desperately. Ivan's bloody face washed up in her mind. Ivan, her loving and protective dad, was dead. Ishani, who pretended to be her mother, had killed him. Rachel almost could not control her agony, her outrage, but then she knew that she had to stay quiet if she ever wanted to see Joel again. Rachel blinked through her tears and realized that continuing to dwell on everything would send her into a panic attack. Her ears felt muffled as if she were underwater. They were ringing so sharply. Her head pulsed in sharp pain with each heartbeat. She took a deep breath. It felt as if she were breathing through thin straws. Finally, she began to pray to God desperately. She moved her lips silently, and her body shook in shock.
God, where are you?
PRISM seemed to engross her with fear and death itself. She could not stay still any longer. Honing her survival instincts, she focused on her surroundings and a way of escape. She stood up and walked further into the room. It was long, dark, and narrow. Something shifted in the shadows, causing her to pause. She froze in place, and after not hearing anything more, she continued forward. The air was icy. At the end of the corridor hung an ornate mirror similar to the one in the mirror room, but smaller. Rachel touched its surface. It rippled. She saw her reflection flutter and shift. To her surprise, it smiled. She was not smiling, but it smiled at her through the glass. This Rachel was confident, but her eyes were a bright green instead of blue. She was in a dark dress with tinges of gold instead of Rachel's morbidly stained wedding dress. Then the reflection spoke to her.
Rachel. What's the matter, Rachel?
It said calmly.
Who are you? What are you?
Rachel stammered, wide-eyed.
Why, I'm you,
said Dark Rachel.
No, you're just another crazy invention that Dr. Crowning has conjured up.
Dark Rachel's smile began to fade.
Dr. Crowning means nothing to me.
She shrugged.
There are forces that even he cannot know. However, I know you want to be free of him. Free from Ishani. I can help you. I know the way out, and I have the key.
She waved the key in her hand.
Where's the exit, then?
said Rachel, not trusting her for a moment.
Right through this doorway.
Dark Rachel's image disappeared, and a doorway with the key in the doorknob appeared where the mirror had been. A few minutes passed, and the wooden doorway seemed so real that Rachel thought she had imagined the whole thing about the mirror. Perhaps her nerves were getting to her. She glanced around and faced forward, reaching toward the new doorknob. However, Dark Rachel reappeared in front of the doorway.
Oh, but there is one more thing before you go. You carry something very special with you. Those sacred gemstones hold much power. We can use them to make everything right. Together, we could use them to stop Dr. Crowning and Ishani for good. You and Joel could have the perfect wedding that you have always wanted. In fact, you, Joel, and the others could live in peace without them interfering in your lives any longer. Isn't that what you want?
Yes, of course it is, but why do I need these gemstones to do it?
Asked Rachel.
You've seen their power, haven't you? That's nothing compared to what you could do with them.
Rachel looked down, and the stones began to glow brightly. However, she knew better than to hand them over. She decided to take matters into her own hands and turned to smash the mirror, but Dark Rachel's hand grabbed her when she touched the glass.
You could have had so much more.
Her jaw tightened as much as her grip.
Such a shame.
Suddenly, Dark Rachel transformed into her true self. Her youthful face drooped slightly and then twisted into Ishani's dreadful face.
Let's finish this,
she said back to her evil self. Rachel let out a wail of utter hopelessness.
No!
Judas and the assistant stepped forward. The assistant held something in his hand that glowed. A large onyx stone dangled from a chain around his neck. Then Rachel felt the same thing brush up against her leg as before. It was black and icy to the touch, and it kept spiraling into prism shapes. The same creature that had jumped from Pandora's microscope. She instinctively grabbed the creature's spiny body and smashed it into Ishani's face, breaking through the mirror. Ishani bent over in agony as it tore at her cheek before it teleported elsewhere. Suddenly, the man with the twisted face, Dr. Ahaz, appeared. He teleported behind her, undaunted by Savta's near-fatal blow back in the tunnels. The blood flowed from his head and chest. Rachel turned, and he shoved his twisted face right into her forehead. He grabbed her as she screamed in horror. Judas helped to pin her from the other side. His face was wild in anger with his scratched-up eyes, the wires still dangling from his head. A strange black beam dripped down from his ear. Ishani gathered herself.
Thank you, Dr. Ahaz, Judas. Despite some faults, you both have been quite the asset to us,
said Ishani. She approached Rachel, running her finger along her cheek, relishing her tears. Rachel struggled more, trying to stomp Judas, but it was useless. The twisted man readjusted and locked her into a chokehold. Then Ishani grasped Rachel's neck. She reached between the creature's grip and tore off the necklace Lydia had given her. She also clasped her hand and wrenched off her engagement ring and bracelet. She held up the jewels and looked at the precious stones in the light.
Yes, although smaller pieces from the originals, these are a wonderful addition to our experiment. Very high quality.
She glanced at the twisted man.
I trust that you have the other.
He grunted an affirmative response, and she took a necklace from a zippered pouch on his cloak. It was Lydia's necklace with her lavender agate stone swirling brightly.
Perfect.
Then she saw the locket around Rachel's neck that Ivan had gifted Rachel when she was small. She opened it and saw their miniature family portrait.
You still insist on keeping this? A life of lies, but for a purpose.
She snarled. Then she flung the locket onto the floor and smashed it to bits with the sharp heel of her boot. Rachel recoiled in fear through her tears. Ishani motioned to her assistant.
It is time. Do it.
She sneered, revealing her razor-sharp teeth. The torn patch of skin on her face looked like some sort of metallic reptilian scales with a dark greenish ooze. Rachel could see that Ishani was no longer fully human physically, but likely she never really was in her heart. The assistant walked over to her and reached his lanky mechanical arms toward Rachel's neck. He glanced at her through his thick glass eyes, smiling broadly. He held a needle in his hand. Rachel struggled one last time before he pierced it into her neck. She heard a voice in her head speak.
I am with you.
It said gently with authority.
Do not fear.
Then she relaxed and her heart slowed its pace. Everything grew dim, and that was all that she remembered. Meanwhile, outside the main gate, Joel and his family had arrived, armed with weapons aglow in their bags. However, they were surprised that many citizens had also arrived despite the war's chaos. The bombs had subsided for the time being. Joel approached a young soldier.
What's going on?
He asked.
Don't you know? The Prime Minister has moved our gathering here due to the bombing at the Wailing Wall. It damaged the old Golden Dome, but the new temple is unharmed. Are you here for the broadcast?
The young soldier looked at Joel's family and their large packs, similar to the ones workers had carried all day. Naturally, he assumed they were there for the opening ceremony for the new PRISM facilities and the third temple. Joel realized that time had passed by so quickly since they had been preoccupied with finding his mother. It was already time for Yom Kippur, the last holiest day of Rosh Hashanah.
I've seen some of your broadcasts, Joel.
He glanced at Chester.
Hopefully they'll have a better opening ceremony than the last one.
He said. Joel was confused. However, Davy thought quickly.
Yeah,
Said Davy.
Joel is here to do his final PRISM segment and capture the Prime Minister's speech on the third temple.
I recognize you, young man. Aren't you the one who hit that UFO with your baseball?
Davy nodded and the soldier grinned.
Right this way.
Said the soldier, leading them through the main entrance.
Thank you, sir.
Said Joel. The rest of his family followed them forward. Yosef glanced at a large portrait on the wall with Dr. Crowning's visage. The frame was elaborately decked in golden patterns and ancient writing. Dr. Crowning held a relic, the onyx stone from Saul's portrait. On his head he wore an elaborate crown. Yosef recognized not only the stone but also the crown on his head. Dr. Crowning had been the one behind the archaeological dig to locate the Ark. The dig that had resulted in an explosion that killed much of his old crew. Dr. Crowning had stolen King David's crown from the tomb, a total desecration and blasphemy. Now, Yosef confirmed the depths of his imprudence in trying to beat his enemies alone. Like many others, he had been tricked into Dr. Crowning's schemes, risking the lives of his own family. A sick feeling welled up in the pit of his stomach.
Yosef, are you coming?
Asked Daniel. Yosef tore his eyes away from the portrait, and Daniel noticed that it had reminded Yosef of the guilt he felt about his past.
Yes, I'm right behind you.
Daniel patted his back and they moved on.
The Lord is with us.
He reminded him. As they entered the facilities, the scientists were scurrying around, making preparations as usual. However, a couple of them looked up at Joel and his family. They began to whisper to one another in concern. They just passed them when the young soldier stopped and said,
Hold it. I have to ensure this area is clear for us to pass.
This is not good.
whispered Joel. The soldier approached one of the guards, and both shot a glance of concern in Joel's direction.
Go,
Said Daniel.
we'll distract them.
As the soldier finished speaking with the guard, Joel ducked down the side corridor toward Pandora's office. Chester followed him closely behind.